Hey woodworkers. So, kicking around boards. I've got too many boards in my shop. Okay, so wanted to talk about sizing the panels for this tool tote. I've already got the grooves cut all the way around. I've already set up my handle. Everything is locked in. What I've done is I've brought a clamp just to squeeze these together because it's going to be so critical to bottom this out to establish an accurate dimension. Without a clamp, this could be pulled away slightly and then you're going to cut your panel too large. Okay, so what I wanted to do is talk about process. So there's a lot of ways that we can measure when these things are taken apart and try to gauge inside face to the bottom of that groove, and that's okay. We can make a little mark here and then mark on the other side. I just feel like there's a lot of variables with this that I don't love. I think there's another option for doing this, and this is what I wanted to show you with this. And with a nice sharp pencil, it's me, I'm sharpening my pencil. With a nice sharp pencil, this becomes pretty easy. So an adjustable square here, doesn't matter what size. I can push that square blade in until it bottoms out into the groove. And then from there, drawing a line. I'll do the same on the other edge. Oops, there we go. Alright, so now I've marked both of the ends here. I just want to make sure before I put a measuring device across this that these ends are in fact square, which they are. By having the bottom into place and then the handle, even though it's not into the mortises, it's at least keeping those ends from kind of pinching in or out. So this is square, so I'm going to measure these and we're good. Alright, a couple different ways of measuring this. The tape measure is a great tool and it's easy, but this hook becomes a bit of an issue, and it's a really horrible idea to try to line up the hook right to that line, because where is that line below the hook and so on and so forth. I've gotten to the habit where I just measure right off of the one, kind of laying that right on top of the line, measuring this thing over, and then I can see exactly what the dimension is here and here. The one, I wouldn't say danger, the one frustration with this is that people will cut the board without removing this 1 inch that they started the measurement from. So right now I'm measuring, it looks like it's 24 1/4, but if I remove this front, or the first inch here, that becomes 23 1/4, and then that's my final dimension. Some people have gotten into a habit of measuring from the 10 and then measuring this thing over, and then if you've already rough cut your material for these panels, then you'll know you don't have 33 1/4 inches to work with. So from here you just now subtract that 10 inches from 33 1/4, that becomes 23 1/4, and that's the dimension of your panel. So hopefully that's helpful. Whatever method works is something that you will use or should use, but just be consistent with it. Alright, so I'm also measuring the bottom groove as well, because I'll need to know that when it comes time to cutting the panels to it. And I think that's all I need to talk about with that. Okay, so I've taken the liberty of already cutting these panels to final length, and I have to do that in order to start cutting in the rabbets accurately. That's good, and that's good. Okay. So I've cut final length. I haven't cut the final width down just yet. I've actually left this much wider than it needs to be because I want to have some options. I know I'm going to cut a rabbet on these ends here and here to go into the grooves, but I also have a groove into the bottom, which I'll also need to cut a rabbet into. So 3 of these surfaces are going to get that rabbet, and I want to make sure that I have enough room to make some mistakes and play around with this. Ideally I want to pick up or keep as much of this black element as possible, so I'm going to, instead of leaving this on the bottom, which I think it kind of gets hidden or forgotten. I want to actually draw a bit more attention to where this thing is. So I'll make it on the top, and then I'll rip this thing down to its final width. Pardon me. So, yeah, what was I saying? Okay, so I've already cut these things down to length. Now it's time to set it up for making the cut. So getting rid of this tool tote temporarily. Okay, so this cut could easily be made on the router table. There's no problem with that. I'm going to opt for doing it on the table saw because it's not going to require a stopped cut anywhere. In other words, I'm going to go all the way through this edge and these ends without having to start and stop the cut in weird ways in the middle of the board. So I think this is a lot faster. A table saw is totally fine with doing this with a good sharp dado blade, and we talked about dado blades in an earlier video, but it's going to make the least amount of time, or going to take the least amount of time for doing this. So what I want to do is, let me counterpoint to that. If I were to use the router table, it would be totally acceptable as well, a little bit slower, and there's a higher propensity for tearing out the grain on the router table depending on how aggressive the cut and how sharp your cutter is. On the table saw it's much faster, but if you have a dull or even a dirty blade, you could have a sharp blade that's dirty, it's got a lot of pitch and other buildup on it, then it has a higher propensity to burning the wood. And those are kind of the trade-offs. But for this is a clean blade, and speed for me is going to be the most important component here. Truth be told, I would have been done with this if I weren't explaining the steps. But but anyway, okay. So I need to make some marks as far as where I want this to go. So this is going to be my outside face here, and I know that because of where the rabbet needs to be created, and it's about 1/4 inch, I'm going to draw a little mark there, transfer that around, that all of these cuts need to be on this outside face, meaning that I'm going to have this thing face down. I don't want to see any of the marks as I'm cutting. So that's going to be the first step. I have the second panel, which I've already cut down to length. I cut them at the same time, which makes sense. I've also cut to kind of show this black streak. So outside face, this will go down as I'm making that cut as well. Okay, so now getting into the operation of this procedure. I have the dado blades already set up in the saw. What I need to do is I'm going to start to align. I'm going to do it for your benefit too. I want to align the tips of the blade to where my mark is. Now I didn't measure this, I'm just doing it by eye, which is never a good way to do it. But I do know, yeah, you're a little higher than my, there we go. I do know that what I want to do is always start with the blade lower than my line and then do a cut and slowly raise up the blade until I get this thing to fit. The line is just a suggestion. The thing that's critical is the relationship between this board, this side, to where the groove fits. And if I overcut it and it's too thin, it's going to be sloppy and bouncing around in there, and that doesn't work. If the blade is too low, then it's going to be super thick and hard to put into place, and that's going to cause it to split the other board or the other part of the project, which I don't want. So it's really got to be just right. So this is intentionally pretty low, and that's great. What I'm going to do is bring this fence over. I see, I've got another situation here. I have to start much lower. Because I don't need much in the way of a cut. I only need this cut to be about this long. So this dimension was what I measured from the square to the inside of the groove. So if I were to line this up to the outside of the blade, I still have way more of a cut that I really want to make. So what I'm going to do is lower this thing down. I'm going to slowly bring this fence over. And so this is a lot closer, and you were pretty close. I'm going to intentionally keep moving to my left to make it a smaller dimension, which is what I want. I don't want to get too confident and overcut this. That looks pretty close. And I don't want to cut right on the line because I know that that's always going to mean I'm going to overcut it. Okay, so at this point I'm ready to start preparing for the next step, which is going to be the blade is freely spinning. What I want to do, turn the blade on while the blade is still below the bed to raise it up so it starts cutting into the sacrificial fence. I really never want to have a situation where the dado blade is cutting right into the side of the fence. If I do, it's an easy way, it's a fast way, it's a horrible way, it's a sinking way of ruining your table saw fence. But I like having a little bit of a gap here between the outside of the tooth, so the one to my right, and then the fence. See a little bit of discoloration here. That's not from blade making contact, it's from some burning wood on a thin cut that I made. It's so easy to permanently scar and damage your fence. And so these are easy enough to replace, but it's an additional cost that is easily avoidable. So, alright, so I've got that here, and I don't want to clamp this in such a way that the clamps are going to interfere with this board going through the cut. So I've drilled some holes into the edge of the board, the sacrificial fence. So I'll clamp that thing down, both ends. I'm using these super fancy expensive clamps that came with a super fancy expensive tool. There are knockoffs of these which work great, but it's what I had and they just made sense. Okay, so when cutting the rabbet on 3 surfaces, I want to always remember to get in the habit of cutting the ends of the board first. So I'll cut that one, I'll flip it around, cut this one, and then I'll cut this edge down here. So then this one goes all the way through. Now you'll notice with this cut, it's much more comfortable for me because the longest section of this board is supported against the fence. When I flip this around on its edge, that changes pretty dramatically. And now the shortest section is the only part that's touching anything, and it's touching the fence, but there's a lot of movement that could potentially happen here. There's nothing back here supporting this as I go through the cut. So what I'm going to use in this operation is a miter gauge. And with this miter gauge, I can hold the longest section of the board, keep it nice and tight up to my fence, which basically functions as a stop, and then go all the way through the cut. I want to make sure that the alignment of these is accurate. These ends were cut squarely, and once it's in position here, I want to make sure that that is reflected. If not, if I approached a fence and I have a gap one way or the other, that's going to translate into the cut, and it's going to start throwing off the ends of your tool tote, make them out of square. So I'm going to reset this one, referencing this end and this edge. Once I'm there, then I'm happy with that. Okay, and I won't need that for when I cut the long surface or the edge, but for these two, I always want to do this to start. Okay, what else was I going to say? I think that's everything. Alright, so I'm going to raise this up until the blade starts making contact with that curve that's already there. I need to go up a little bit higher than that, but I'm going to do a series of test cuts to make sure that the height is accurate, not too high, not too low. And you'll notice that I'm not going to bottom out this all the way against the fence. I'm going to pull this away, so I'm just barely making a little bit of a cut on the end to gauge the thickness. And if you're worried about, cutting your actual piece too small, I've saved an offcut from these panels, same exact thickness. That's the critical piece. I can use this, run it over until the fit is right, and then I'll be able to use my actual material into place, and that's always a good idea, always a good practice. All right, I'm going to do it this way just for brains. One of the thing that's important to note is that it's probably, you've heard it said before, possibly by me, possibly by others, that you should never use the fence and the miter gauge simultaneously, right? So it's either one or the other, never both. And that's true if we had a single blade and that blade were elevated up so that it's cutting off a piece. Because I'm going to support this section, but then there's going to be, at some point, a piece between the spinning blade and the fence that's going to come back at a high rate of speed, which is not a lot of fun. Because I'm just cutting a rabbet here, I'm not separating any elements of this board, I'm just removing on the bottom. So I'll always have contact against the fence, always have contact against the miter gauge. If you do that, or have done that, you're going to be totally fine. Okay, I think that's everything. Let me check for time. Okay. Here we go. Thickness there, gotta keep going. Still going in the right direction. Alright, I just want to pull this over so it's a little closer. See how I'm doing on fit. I've got another 30 seconds or so to remove. So I'm going to keep raising up this blade and get to it. When you're adjusting the height of this blade, it's always important to end as you're raising the blade. What I don't want to do is start with the blade much taller and then back it down because of the play in the threads of the mechanisms that raise and lower the blade. If I lower it, there's a little bit of slop, pardon me, in between those threads, so it'll drop lower and lower and lower just from the vibration of the machine. So by raising it up until I'm at my final thickness, that engages the threads the whole time.